Marlene and Michael a lot. Marlene, every time they started, music was going, Marlene started dancing. When we were in New Zealand and Southeast Australia, it was cold. And I was always mindful of the left side. I don't know why. But I said, look, I'm cold. Now, there's no Puerto Rican was cold back then. Because they were more much I don't know how but this morning sermon is inspired by one of the authors. And I highly encourage you troubleshoot all these things. If you have the Bible, probably Romans 8, verses 19 to 1. The Bible says, creation has suffered because of man's rebellion and sin. Nature did not choose that God allowed it to suffer. Thus, and look forward to the restoration of all things just as yes, nature itself will be delivered from the effects of sin, free from decay. Glory to God. You know that all creation has been thrown under the Lord, suffering like those who shall in the beginning of our rebellion unto now. Again, my message is titled Father and Son. We thank the Lord that everything around us is negative. Reminds us that one day you will come. Now, Lord, we open your word. You would have us to learn our own word. We were traveling on the same field. Black leather seats. Ride smooth as if you just floated on the road. The air was conducive and content as we moved through Australia's outback. We were watching nature move from subtle green in the southwest from Melbourne and Sydney to a more centrally located, dry, arid environment. Now it's spring. Right in the center. At this time, it was my in the jump seat, the front seat. And I heard Sally, the tour guide,
yell out, "Winston, it's your turn to ride in the front seat." Everybody was rushing to the front seat. The front passenger seat, or the jump seat, was the place for the Kodak moments. You know what I'm talking about. You had the best view and the best seat in the house, where those who rode, as we say here, shotgun, took in a panoramic IMAX view of nature at its best. It was like, the bus driver, a former naturalist, Australian naturalist, turned bus driver and tour guide. An intelligent man, to say the least, who defended at its best intellectually the Ice Age. After all, failure is just that he believed that the earth is millions upon millions of years old, or as he would say, millions of years ago, this happened. And eventually man evolved. As we drove through the wonders of nature, the bus driver kept saying millions upon millions of years ago, during the glacial period, such and such a thing happened. It was studied. It was a studied intellectual attempt to clarify the beauty of the vast outback, for which I could respect his conclusions. While we were taking our potty breaks, as you do on long trips on a bus, we were milling around at the bus stop, and I just happened to get near him and in a casual way to make one comment as we stood. And as I travel now, like I was saying in Sabbath school, I never tried to give a Bible study on the Sabbath. But I tried to implement friendship evangelism. Just be friends. And while we were there on the potty break, milling around next to the bus, I looked at him and I said, "Oh, so you don't believe in a young earth?" He paused, and I broke his preoccupation as if he gave me that look. "What are you talking about?" I was on his ground level now. Maybe he didn't think I had a little knowledge of creation. But I said, "You don't believe in a young earth." He paused momentarily, looked at me and said, "Well, where did all it start?" I thought and I said, "From nothing." And he responded, "Correct." Well, that's where it will all end. Nothing. With our conversation ending that time, because he was driving the bus, and that time I had moved to the back seat, I thought about his comment. And because before we could end the conversation, as we would normally do, tip the driver and move on to our next place of stay. And I thought, and I thought, and I thought to myself, I wanted to finish that conversation with him. But as we moved on to New Zealand, again, I was in the jump seat. And I had my camera and I was just getting every shot I could because it's beautiful to say the least. And once again, I was in the front seat, and all of a sudden, as nature just swallowed us up, I looked at Sally, the tour guide, and I said, Sally, you know, I was talking to so and so, and I said, I just cannot accept the fact that all of this began millions of years ago. And she said, well, Winston, some of us believe different. Well, Sally and I was on a friendship basis at this moment in time now. And further, I discovered later that she knew a Seventh-day Adventist, a boyfriend that she was engaged to. So I could relax a little bit and talk just a little bit more. And I said, Sally, what I was talking about to the other driver was, who was very philosophical, I said, I mentioned to him I believe in a young earth. In other words, the creation story. I believe that the earth was created we were created in 7 days. And on the seventh day, the Lord rested. I wasn't a young earth. But as I thought about the driver, I was looking from God's point of view, heaven down. Let's go back to a time when things were good, a time when the earth was young and fertile, and there was no such thing as sin. The Bible says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. I said, Sally, look at the orderliness. I'm talking to Sally now. I wish I had been talking to the driver. How is it that the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west? The consistency. How is it that we have spring and autumn and fall and summer? When it gets too hot, all of a sudden the switch comes on to tone it down. How is it when it gets too cold, even here in Australia, the switch comes on to warm it up? The Bible says, you set the earth firmly in orbit, and no one can shake it out of its place. When God created Adam and Eve, their dwelling place was called Eden, the garden of delight. For Eden was the place where God can make it was exceedingly beautiful. Its surface was diversified with mountains and hills and plains, interspersed with noble rivers and lovely lakes. The hills and mountains were not abrupt and rugged, and even in that there is beauty, folks. Neither was there terrific steeps and frightful chasms as we drove through New Zealand, and all of a sudden you could see it in a distance, and as we drove on, it just swallowed us up. Nature. The sharp, ragged edges, Ellen White, for the rights of Earth's rocky framework were buried beneath the fruitful soil, which everywhere produced a luxuriant growth of verdure. There were no swamps. Nature. There were no barren desert, the outback. And my wife said she could live in the outback. I had to take 2 looks at her. Grateful shrubs and delicate flowers greeted the eye at every turn, Ellen White says. The trees were tall and more majestic than any that now exist. The air, the climate was untainted by haze or pollution. It was clear and healthful to breathe. The entire landscape was laid out in beauty with grounds decorated as that of a proud palace. Have you ever seen a palace grounds? They're immaculate. The angelic host viewed the scene with delight and rejoiced at the wonderful works of God. The Ice Age? Oh no.